blood in the arena, gleaming helmets and swords, men fighting wild beasts. These are just some of the images that come to mind when we think about the gladiatorial games. But did the reality of the games actually correspond to the way they're presented to us today? From this point on, forget everything you've seen in the movies and on TV, because what we're going to share with you will forever change the way you see these indomitable warriors. Before we get started though, please remember to subscribe to this channel, like this video, and leave a comment. Your contribution is extremely important to help us continue producing content for this channel. Is there anyone out there who still hasn't seen Ridley Scott's Gladiator? His memorable scenes, along with plenty of other movies and TV series, have contributed to our general knowledge of gladiators by depicting the most spectacular, and the bloodiest, moments of the ancient games in the Colosseum. But over the years, these works have also generated a lot of misinformation through the historical inaccuracies they contain. By now, some of these inaccuracies have become so deeply rooted in our popular culture that they're generally assumed to be true. So today, we're going to put everything you think you know about gladiators to the test by debunking 5 of the biggest lies that surround the world of gladiatorial combat in ancient Rome. Put on your armor, unsheath your gladius, and come along with us through this new episode of Antiqua Archeologia. Let's get started. Myth 1. We'll start with perhaps the most famous gladiatorial myth of all, the pollex versus. This term, which means thumbs down in English, refers to the famous practice of spectators giving a thumbs up or a thumbs down to decide the fate of a defeated fighter. Cinematography has had a huge influence on this myth in particular. In fact, Ridley Scott's Gladiator contains a perfect example of the pollex versus. In one of the film's most memorable scenes, Emperor Commodus, played by a very young Joaquin Phoenix, raises his fist with his thumb pointing upwards to grant mercy to the defeated gladiator Maximus Decimus Meridius, delighting the crowd of spectators. But is this really what would have happened? In their analysis of the historical sources, researchers have identified a particular phrase that comes up again and again in reference to deciding the fate of a defeated gladiator. In Juvenal's satires, it appears as verso pollice vulgus cum iubet, which translates to, when the crowd orders with a turned thumb. Prudentius, meanwhile, uses the term con verso pollice. But while we can easily recognize these phrases as references to the pollex versus, they don't indicate the exact orientation of the thumb. This gives rise to the perennial question: was it the thumbs up or the thumbs down that sentenced a gladiator to death? While there's no historical source that spells it out clearly, it is plausible, according to numerous scholars, that the death sentence was decreed with the thumb pointing upwards. This is most likely because a raised thumb resembles a drawn sword, ready to strike the opponent. It's also possible that the hand was left open and not closed into a fist. That's because gesturing with an open hand with the thumb pointing upwards may have been easier to see, especially from a distance. You might therefore think that a thumb pointing downwards represented salvation. But no. According to the most recent scholarship, it seems this gesture never actually existed in antiquity, and therefore wouldn't have held any meaning. So, how could the emperor grant clemency to a defeated warrior? In this case, archaeology comes to our aid. In 1997, the Cavallargus medallion was found in southern France. This Roman medallion, dating to between the 2nd and 3rd century AD, depicts 2 gladiators at the end of a duel. On the far right, we can see a man extending his arm towards the fighters, with his thumb tucked into his fist. From the inscription on the medallion, we know that the duel ended in a draw and that both gladiators were spared. Using this medallion as evidence gives us some additional context. If the thumb represents a sword, and decreeing death is portrayed by raising the thumb upward, much like unsheathing a sword, then the granting of grace would be represented by keeping the thumb sheathed, or tucked into the fist. This thumb stuck in the fist, or pollux pressus, as all you Latins out there might call it, therefore represented salvation. But if all of that is true, then where did the inaccuracy come from? It can be traced back to French artist Jean-Léon Gérôme's 1872 painting Pollice Verso, which depicts the final moments of a fight between gladiators in an amphitheater. The victorious gladiator stands in the center of the arena, his foot on his opponent's neck, awaiting the emperor's verdict. But it's the group of Vestal virgins in a neighboring section of the stands who, in the grip of fury, extend their hands with their thumbs pointing down to invoke the death of the defeated gladiator. This painting had an incredibly strong and lasting influence on depictions of the Pollux Versus in popular culture. So much so that when director Ridley Scott learned the true nature of the gesture while working on Gladiator, he decided to replicate the inaccurate version seen in the painting in order to avoid confusing audiences. Myth 2. Everyone knows that when gladiators entered the arena, they greeted the emperor with a cry of Ave Caesar, morituri te salutant, or in English, Hail Caesar, we who are about to die salute you. Or did they? While this phrase has certainly become very famous, there's only a grain of truth to this one. According to the surviving sources, this phrase was indeed spoken, but on only one occasion and by one specific group of people. It happened in 52 AD, at the beginning of a naumachia, or a reenactment of a naval battle, which was being sponsored by Emperor Claudius to raise support for the restoration of Lake Fucino. According to Suetonius, a group of men who'd been sentenced to death, and whose execution would form part of the spectacle, called out to Claudius using this now famous phrase. But because they were trying to ingratiate themselves with him, they addressed him with the term imperator, or emperor, not as Caesar, meaning the original phrase as spoken was Ave Imperator, morituri te salutant. Apparently, Claudius's response to the greeting was aut non, which means maybe not. And this response led to a scene that was quite hilarious in context. Once they realized Claudius had heard them and was possibly pardoning them, some of the condemned men no longer wanted to participate in the spectacle. Claudius, in a fit of anger, rose from his seat and stormed up and down the lake, threatening and shouting at the condemned men, until he managed to convince them to fight. Myth 3. Among the many myths about gladiators, one of the most pervasive is that ars gladiatoria, or the art of gladiatorial combat, was reserved exclusively for men. We're very sorry if we're disappointing anyone out there, but the truth is that women also fought hard in the arena. Clashes between female gladiators were much rarer than those of their male counterparts, but they absolutely took place. We don't know exactly when the first match between women occurred, but we can try to trace a timeline using the surviving textual and archaeological sources. Two elements that can help us get started are a pair of decrees promulgated by the Roman Senate that prohibit women from becoming gladiatrixes, as they would have been known. The first of these decrees dates to 11 AD, under the Emperor Augustus, and it prohibits free-born women under age 20 from participating in gladiatorial games. This restriction was further tightened through the Senatus Consultum of Larinum, issued in 19 AD under Emperor Tiberius. This second decree, which has come down to us on a bronze tablet known as the Tabula Larinus, prohibited all men and women of the senatorial class, and the class just below it, known as the equestrian class, from participating in the games. The existence of these two decrees is itself fairly solid proof of the existence of female gladiators. After all, why would the Senate have bothered to pass a law banning something that never happened? The text of these decrees also reveals for us that gladiatorial combat involved not just women from the lower classes, but noble women as well. The latter would have had to voluntarily act outside of their social class in order to fight in the arena. We should also emphasize that the decree focused on free-born women and therefore did not apply to slaves. This suggests that slave women would still have been allowed to participate in the games. Through the writings of Cassius Dio, for example, we know that in 66 AD, Emperor Nero organized a series of gladiatorial games at the amphitheater of Pozzuoli. In honor of the sovereign Tiridates I of Armenia, and that slave women of Ethiopian origin fought each other at these games. Despite the decrees, some noble women and senators still went down to the arena during Nero's reign, as Tacitus tells us in his Annals. This subject is also discussed by Cassius Dio, who highlights how some of them went willingly and others rather reluctantly. It seems that Nero personally encouraged them to participate, and, as Tacitus reports, it was difficult to refuse a request from the emperor, especially as he himself was accustomed to performing in public. Meanwhile, Suetonius, in his Lives of the Caesars, tells us that during the reign of Domitian, women were very popular in the amphitheater and that they were made to fight at night by torchlight. Through Cassius Dio, we know that these fights under Domitian always pitted women against men with dwarfism, and that these were the only men whom female gladiators were allowed to fight. It seems, however, that these fights were presented as entertainment for the spectators between the bloodier and more serious bouts. The phenomenon of female gladiators was controversial, to say the least. In a strongly patriarchal society like ancient Rome, where the role of women was understood to revolve around maintaining the home and raising children, the idea of gladiatrixes both excited the crowds and met with harsh criticism from more conservative voices. One of these was Juvenal, who, in his satires, laments over the indecency of housewives donning weapons and entering the arena. In addition to the textual sources we've been discussing, there is some archaeological evidence of gladiatrixes. It's much scarcer than the textual evidence, but it's there. In this regard, the main archaeological find is the Stele of Halicarnassus, a bas-relief recovered at Halicarnassus in Turkey, and currently preserved at the British Museum, which depicts two female fighters. The inscription surrounding them tells us two important details. One, that their names were Amazon and Achillea, though these may have been stage names. And two, both of them were pardoned, which means their fight was declared a draw, a kind of reward for having fought bravely. Each gladiatrix's equipment consists of a shield, a sword, greaves, and a sleeve covering one arm. Notably, neither is wearing a helmet or a tunic. Scholars agree that they would have fought bareheaded and bare-chested, just like the Greek Amazons, to whom gladiators of all kinds love to compare themselves. This evidence alone would appear to confirm the existence of female gladiators. There is also another find, but its attribution is rather uncertain. We're talking about the Hamburg statuette, a small sculpture that depicts a woman holding a curved object in her hand. For many years, it was believed that this object was a strigil, a personal hygiene tool used by athletes in ancient Rome, and for this reason, the woman was thought to be an ordinary athlete. But more recently, some scholars have interpreted the object as a sika, that is, the curved sword used by the Thracian class of gladiators. This, in addition to several other elements, her rather victorious pose, plus the presence of the loincloth and the band around the knee, which were said to have been worn by female gladiators, now lead researchers to conclude that she is, in fact, a fighter. However, as we've said, this remains a hypothesis for now. As we have seen, gladiatrixes had been taking to the arena at least since the reign of Augustus. The tradition nevertheless ended in the 2nd century AD, when Emperor Septimius Severus imposed a law that categorically forbid all women from participating in gladiatorial games. In conclusion, we can definitively say that female gladiators existed, and that their existence is well attested by both ancient textual sources and archaeological documentation. While their presence in the arena was not as habitual or as generalized as that of their male counterparts, it was real, and it was widespread enough to reach us. Myth 4. We've all heard the stories of gladiators fighting ferocious wild animals in the arena, but did they really do that? There's a lot of confusion about this one in particular, both because we tend to think of gladiators as the sole protagonists of the games, and because we also know that animals did regularly make an appearance in the arena. But the truth is that clashes between gladiators and animals never happened. In fact, the Day of the Munera, as these events were collectively called in ancient Rome, offered more than just clashes between gladiators. There were also two other types of shows that took place on these days, both of which involved the use of wild animals. The first was the venationes, or animal hunts. a show where armed men faced wild animals of all kinds. The men were all highly skilled professional hunters, known as venatores, and they were accompanied in the arena by assistants called bestiari. There was absolutely no overlap between venatores and gladiators. Everything about these two categories was separate, down to the ludus, or training school, where they practiced. In fact, the training hall for the venatores was called the ludus matutinus, or morning school, because the venationes took place in the morning. These hunts were truly a sight to behold, and they were incredibly grandiose in scale. It's said that as many as 5,000 animals were hunted during the inaugural games at the Colosseum, hosted by Emperor Titus. That number was outdone only by the munera organized by Emperor Trajan to celebrate the defeat of the Dacians, in which a full 9,000 animals were slaughtered. From these records, it's plain to see that when we talk about bloody encounters between men and animals in the arena, most of the blood was shed by the animals and comparatively little by the fighters. The other spectacle was the midday show, where wild animals were used to execute criminals. Naturally, this type of capital punishment, called damnatio ad bestias, was reserved for criminals of the lowest social classes who had committed a serious crime. A nobleman would never have been made to die in such a manner. These criminals were often thrown into the arena naked and without weapons, where the animals, usually tigers, lions, bears, or panthers, were waiting for them. Alternately, they might be tied to a pole and left for the animals to find them. If the animal didn't seem especially interested in the condemned man, armed bestiari were at the ready to provoke it into attacking. In some cases, these executions were made into a spectacle where the criminals were assigned the role of a mythical figure who had endured a horrible torture. For example, some were made to take on the role of the hero Prometheus, who had his liver devoured by an eagle. In these cases, however, the eagle was played by a bear. Similarly, some were thrown into the arena with only a lyre in hand to interpret the famous myth of Orpheus, who, much like the criminals would be, was torn to pieces alive. Myth 5. We'll close this episode with a myth that seems to be almost universally accepted, that an enormous amount of blood was shed at every gladiatorial games, and that every fight inevitably led to the death of the loser. What not many people know is that the world of gladiatura was more like today's football leagues, a real business. In fact, gladiators were bought and sold, much like modern professional athletes. Once purchased, they belonged to gladiatorial gyms, which could be considered true businesses in the modern sense. At the head of each gym, or ludus, there was the lanista, one of the premier businessmen of the ancient Roman world. He bought and sold gladiators and paid for their daily upkeep and training, all with the goal of renting them out at high prices to the men who organized gladiatorial games in the various amphitheaters, namely the editors. Every gladiator, especially the very best ones, therefore had high financial worth, and the hypothetical death of any gladiator would have spelled a serious operational loss for the lanista. In the event of a gladiator's death in the arena, the editor had to reimburse the lanista for his loss, and that compensation ran at about 10 times the gladiator's initial rental fee. This sum was expected to cover the future earnings that the dead gladiator potentially would have generated in subsequent clashes. This means that, in practice, no gladiator would have been sentenced to death without the organizers of the games first crunching the numbers and carefully evaluating the finances at their disposal. In addition to all of the above, it's generally true that the gladiators who were sentenced to death were those who fought improperly, or in a way that didn't demonstrate their courage or their full set of skills. It was much more likely that both gladiators in each match would give it their all, and that their fighting would therefore result in a spectacular show, with both men pushing themselves to their limits and showing off their incredible talent and bravery. Even the one who was defeated would often earn the respect and sympathy of the audience, and this would usually nudge the editor to give him a second chance. The only type of gladiatorial games that involved the certain death of the loser were the munera sine missione, or fights in which it was known from the outset that mercy would not be granted. These kinds of events were widely publicized during the imperial age, which suggests that the missio, or the granting of mercy to the defeated fighter, had by that time become the more common practice. And with that last myth debunked, this episode ends here. Thank you very much for your participation and your interest. If you want to support Antigua Archeologia, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and leave a comment below. For this video, let us know which of these myths sparked your curiosity the most. Until the next episode, see you soon!